Chapter 15. The Grim Game. Houdini woke up disoriented. He had no idea how much time had elapsed. The cage had landed on the tracks. He looked at the cliff not 10 feet away. Well, I guess it could have been worse. First order of business was to get the cage off the tracks and out of the way of the next train. He rocked the steel cage back and forth. However, although the cage was light, it wouldn't budge. Damaged by the fall, the bent frame had somehow gotten wedged beneath the rail foot of a track, and even with his great strength, he wasn't able to dislodge it. All right, then. Scratch that. Let's get the door open. He reached for his belt buckle and his lockpick, and then remembered he'd left the belt at the spook house when he dressed so hurriedly. He sighed. The thought that he, the great Houdini, might be rescued from a dog cage by a passer-by flashed through his mind, and the ignominy of such a fate made him shudder. For he was quite certain that Langdon was merely taunting him, and had no idea when the next train would come along. This is the sticks, after all. How often do trains really run? He crouched in the cage, pondering that question despondently, calculating miles between cities. Then he began to feel vibrations through the metal bars. A train really was coming. How far away it was he couldn't guess. Better open that lock, quick. He dug into his pants pocket, searching for anything that could serve as a pick, the stem of a pocket watch, a paperclip, but found nothing except coins. What would his movie alter ego, Haldane of the Secret Service, do? Through the bars he spied a loose railroad spike more than a yard away. Quickly he kicked off his right shoe and, sockless, extended his foot through the bars. When Houdini was a young unknown, he soaked up everything about show business he could, from every performer right down to the circus geeks and freaks. From the armless wonder, he learned how to use his toes as fingers, and could use them to pick up a pin from the ground, immeasurably useful in his escapes. And the knack came in very handy now. With his toes, Houdini grasped the nail and manipulated it. Within a few moments, he had extracted the rusty 6-inch nail from the railroad tie. The cage was beginning to rattle now. Houdini looked up. Far in the distance he could see the approaching train, a wisp of smoke above it. With the nail in hand, he used it to pick the lock. For anyone with less manual dexterity, it would be far too large and crude a tool for the job, but inside of a minute, Houdini defeated the lock. Now it was a simple matter of untying the rope. He thought, that nutty blabbermouth's silly knot can be beat in seconds. The train sounded its horn, and Houdini could see it was now less than 2 miles away. A cow ambled out of its path. The magician was not easily given to panic, but the sulphurous stench of coal was like a foretaste of hell. He reached for the knot, and was dismayed to see that the cage had landed with the knot below, and a bar pressing down on it. He lay down and squeezed his fingers under the cage, groping for the knot. He could hear the roar of the train now bearing down. There was simply not enough time to undo the knot. One chance left. He began to chomp on the rope. The train was less than 100 yards away now, near enough for him to see the conductor through the window and vice versa. The horrified engineer applied the brakes, and Houdini heard them shrieking. But there was no way the locomotive would stop before it smashed the cage to smithereens. Houdini bit through the rope with the ferocity of a rabid beaver, imagining the newspaper headlines. Houdini dies in dog cage, biting rope. The boys at the New York Herald will have a field day with this, he thought. With the train less than 30 feet away, he gnashed through until only a few threads remained, and then used all his might to rip the rope in two. He pushed the cage door, it sprang open, and he dived straight out. The escape artist rolled up to one knee as if he'd rehearsed the stunt for a serial. Houdini triumphs again, he cried, shaking a fist at the train. I'll have to put this in an act, he thought. Call it something like the train of death. There was a terrific clang as the train smashed the cage to bits. The door flew off, directly at Houdini. He ducked, but the door slammed into his chest. Crying out in pain, he rolled head over heels down the embankment, and the momentum carried him off the cliff. To his horror, the escape artist found himself staring down at jagged boulders 90 feet below. He dangled by the back of his shirt, which had caught on a wispy branch jutting from the mountainside. It would have been a comic pose if he were Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd. Houdini heard a loud rip, and as he reached for the branch, the shirt tore. The next thing he knew, he was halfway out of the shirt, hanging from one sleeve over the abyss. Houdini did not have an inordinate fear of heights, this man who'd hung upside down in a straitjacket hundreds of feet in the air from a skyscraper in Washington, D.C. But he also didn't possess a shatterproof body. The shirt began to shred, and terror set in as he tried to climb the cloth rope. The shirt tore in half, and Houdini was suddenly airborne, plummeting to his death. He shut his eyes and cried, "Father!" It was half plea, half greeting. "Reach, Houdini!" a deep, familiar voice commanded. Eyes still shut, Houdini stretched out his hand blindly, and suddenly it was in the grip of a man's hand, large and sure. When he opened his eyes, he saw the mustachioed face of Sir Arthur, smiling with the warmth of a favorite uncle. The author grabbed hold of his other arm and pulled him to safety. After the car ran out of gas, Conan Doyle and Eva had borrowed the pair of horses from the field. They raced to the scene bareback, and the two steeds were now nibbling grass a few yards away. An elderly man lived in a cabin a short distance from where the injured magician lay. Eva ran to the house, where the hermit reluctantly scrounged through a drawer and found a first-aid kit. Conan Doyle, kneeling beside Houdini, splashed hydrogen peroxide on the magician's left shoulder, which had been slashed open by the broken cage door. Houdini sat propped up against an oak tree, still shaken by his brush with death. He struggled to find adequate words. "I owe you my life, Sir Arthur. I am forever in your debt. Those vicious things I said back in the house." Conan Doyle put a finger to his lips. "Have you forgotten that you saved my life too, and Eva's? In situations of duress, I've heard men say far worse, curse God himself even. Let us forgive each other and never speak of it again, shall we?" Houdini scrutinized his savior's face. Sir Arthur might be capable of self-delusion on a grand scale, but he did not deceive others. His forgiveness was genuine. The magician stuck out his hand, and they shook with the ferocity of Indian braves becoming blood brothers. Conan Doyle set about methodically stitching the escape artist's wound. Sir Arthur had shut down his medical practice decades ago, in 1891, to devote all his time to writing, but he never completely abandoned his role as healer. When he'd volunteered to serve as a surgeon in the Boer War, he astounded visitors to the hospital ward with his rigor and calm demeanor, treating men with horrible wounds and others beset by enteric fever. However, he remained modest about his medical skills. "They say no living patient of mine is to be found," Sir Arthur joked. "You now belong to a very elite club, consisting of one member, precisely." "I'll wear the scar proudly," Houdini said, wincing as a needle penetrated his flesh. "You know, Sir Arthur, I always wanted to be a doctor, like my brother Leo. I think Father would have liked that." "I fancy he'd be quite proud of what you've accomplished, my dear friend. You've become an idol to millions around the world, and have become as rich as Croesus in the process." Houdini looked wistfully at his companion as the doctor wrapped a bandage around the wound. "You fellows do real things for people. Me? I'm a fake in every way." "Remember, I'm not a doctor anymore. I make up stories about mummies and dinosaurs," Sir Arthur protested, shaking his head. "I'm an actor too, old fellow, taking up one role after another to dream up what my characters would say. It's all make-believe, isn't it? Kid stuff." As he finished bandaging the injured performer, he waxed philosophical. "Every man is an actor, I suppose. The army captain who must pretend to be unafraid, the school teacher who plays the role of a caring educator while wishing he were off fishing." Eva crouched beside the magician and brushed his hair, which was totally in array, back into place. "Let us not forget the actress who plays a medium." "Or the actor who plays the part of a man who can escape from anything," smiled Houdini. She and Conan Doyle helped Houdini to his feet, and as the trio walked toward the horses, the author recited from Macbeth. "Out, out, brief candle! Life's but a walking shadow. A poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. 'Tis a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." As they reached the horses, he asked, "Do you ride, Harry?" Harry shook his head. "Not in years." "Then I must ask you to ride with Eva." So Arthur helped the young woman onto a speckled mare, and then Houdini behind her. Conan Doyle, an accomplished horseman, hoisted himself onto the other animal, a sturdy chestnut quarter-horse. Houdini hadn't had the best luck in the equine department. Years earlier he attempted to escape from a horse while tied to its back. The skittish creature bolted, and he wound up miles away. He freed himself, but much to his embarrassment, most of the crowd had drifted away by the time he made his way back. Now he sat with his hands at Eva's slender waist, a position he found most awkward. As the horses set off, it was impossible to keep clear of her backside. His face reddened as he tried to keep as far away as possible. "You'll have to hold me tighter than that," Eva said coquettishly. "Don't worry, I have no intention of stealing you from your wife."
"Tally-ho! The game is afoot!" Conan Doyle roared, his sense of adventure returning.
"Fox hunting too, Sir Arthur?" laughed Eva. "Is there any sport you haven't given a try?"
"When one joins the hoi polloi, chasing after the poor red canines is a requirement, I'm afraid," he replied as they galloped beside the tracks. "I didn't go in much for blood sports, but when I was courting Jean, she was quite the horsewoman. I bought Brigador and Corsico and rode to the hounds with her. Got quite fond of those two horses. Nothing quite gets a man in touch with nature as a ride through the country."
The old recluse didn't have a telephone, but there was one at a gas station several miles down the road, and food as well. Houdini, who was on quite good terms with the police, having escaped from jail cells all over the world, with letters from bedazzled commissioners to prove it, called a friend on the New York police force. "You've got to arrest this Langdon fellow as soon as the train arrives in Penn Station," he told the police captain. "Don't let him give you the slip. Check every passenger. He's a master of disguise with more faces than Lon Chaney." They boarded a train at Richmond and were at New York's bustling Penn Station hours later. They were disappointed when Houdini's friend, Captain McCarthy, informed them that Langdon had not been found. "He wasn't on the train. We inspected every man who got off, Houdini," Captain McCarthy said with a pronounced Irish brogue. "Only the men?" the escape artist groaned. The cop slapped his forehead. "Mother of Mary! There was an old woman, very tall, who claimed she'd seen a man with a red beard jump off the train outside the city. I sent 20 men to search the woods. Do you think that she was him, sending us on a wild goose chase?"
"Let me hazard a guess," the author said. "She sounded just like your sweet grandmother in Dublin."
Captain McCarthy covered his mouth sheepishly. "Kilkenny, actually, sir." Houdini pictured the killer slipping through a gauntlet of police with a clever disguise and improvised dialogue. "I'm never going to knock community theater again," he said. "This guy is good. Just like our man Langdon to toy with the local constabulary instead of simply holding its tongue. More flamboyant than Dr. Moriarty." "He could be anywhere in the city," Houdini growled in frustration. "Where would you go if you were in his shoes?" Eva asked the men. Her companions mulled that over as crowds of office workers pouring into the train station from the suburbs pushed past them.
"I would board the next ship leaving America," Sir Arthur declared.
Chapter 16. Up, Up, and Away. In the offices of the White Star Line, Houdini, Conan Doyle, and Eva questioned officials about ships due to cast off imminently or that had recently set sail. There were 4 passenger ships due to leave New York Harbor that day on transatlantic voyages, all on that line. One was bound for England, another to Spain, a third to New Zealand, and the 4th to Borneo by way of Cape Town.
"He'll want to get as far away from the reach of the law as he can," observed Sir Arthur. "I think we can eliminate Europe."
"That leaves Borneo and New Zealand," said Houdini. "Do we flip a coin?" "Don't you have a list of the passengers?" Eva asked Mr. Sloane, the manager of the line.
"Yes, but from what you've told me, I presume he's using an assumed name. Still, if we can see the lists of passengers on the 2 ships," Sir Arthur said, "we're looking for a man traveling alone who booked his passage at the last minute. Surely they can't be many."
"Dozens, I assure you," said Sloane.
"If you would indulge us, please."
Sloane sighed and went about procuring the lists. When he returned, the investigators were dismayed to see that earlier that day 30 single men had purchased tickets on the Victoria, bound for Borneo, and twice that number on the New Zealand ship. Conan Doyle perused the former list, while Houdini and Eva scoured the latter. "Adelic Damiani," Eva read aloud. "Adelic isn't an Italian name, is it?" "Damiani is Hungarian," the magician informed her.
"Aha!" Conan Doyle cried. The others crowded around.
He pointed out a name on the list. "John Watson," Sloane read aloud. "What of it?" "Dr. Watson," Eva said. "Sherlock Holmes's friend."
"Langdon enjoys taunting us," Conan Doyle reminded them. "This has the earmark of a private joke."
"Still, Watson, a common name," Houdini said, frowning.
"A happy coincidence?"
"We'll find out." Houdini turned to Sloane. "When does the Victoria cast off? We've got to catch him before she leaves the harbor." "I'm afraid she left port 4 hours ago," the White Star manager replied. "Is there no boat fast enough to catch up with her? That scoundrel cannot be allowed to escape scot-free. He's killed more than 12 people, tried to kill 3 others, and, if I might add, left me stuck with a traffic ticket thanks to his wretched parking."
Sloane shook his head. "Not the Victoria. Captain Jones is famous for going full speed. She is probably going better than 30 knots.
"Well, order her turn around, then," Eva demanded.
Mr. Sloane looked over his glasses at the still disheveled young woman. "And you are—"
"I am one of the people this madman tried to murder."
"Madam, it's not so simple a matter to turn a ship around. There are other passengers to be considered, procedures, protocol." "Damn your procedures, you ninny!" Conan Doyle bellowed, red in the face. "We're telling you there's a killer on that ship, and everyone aboard is in mortal danger."
Sloane responded coolly.
"There's no call for profanity, Sir Conan Doyle. This is not one of your novels in which Professor Lestrade can order every hansom cab in London stopped and searched. At the very least, we shall need an arrest warrant issued. Then I can alert my superiors to begin the process of—"
"Borneo!" Houdini suddenly exclaimed, pounding a fist into his palm in frustration. "I bet there's no extradition treaty. Is it even a country? Once that monster gets there, our law can't touch him." He began to pace back and forth, furiously, winding up like a clock, as he had when they were trapped in the spook house. Conan Doyle fell into a chair. The non-stop chase across states had finally caught up with the aging author.
"Well, my friends, we've given a good accounting of ourselves, but it's out of our hands now."
Suddenly Houdini turned to his friends. "An airplane!" Founded just a year earlier, Aerial Marine Airways operated a dozen Model 85 seaplanes dubbed flying boats. The aircraft were converted U.S. Navy F-5L planes, modified for civilian usage. The company, headquartered in the Times Building, offered service between New York City and Atlantic City, Key West, Miami, and Bimini. The fleet was flown by former Navy pilots, a point the owners emphasized in newspaper advertisements assuring passengers' safety. The line was nicknamed the Highball Express for whisking wealthy Americans wary of Prohibition to the Caribbean to wet their whistles. Touted in the ads as the modern way to travel, the airborne yachts boasted mahogany cabins with comfortable reclining leather chairs trimmed with silk. Eva watched passengers arrive at the Aero Marine Airport dock on the Hudson River at 82nd Street near the Columbia Yacht Club. Most were dressed to the nines. To fly an airplane was seen as an extraordinarily serious affair, and business attire was de rigueur. Houdini pointed proudly to the airplane they would use to catch the Victoria, an old prototype for the Model 75 that had been mothballed until one of the pilots received Houdini's urgent phone call. As mechanics fueled it and readied it for takeoff, a man on a ladder finished painting Houdini in huge red letters on the fuselage. "We shan't be traveling incognito, I take it," said Conan Doyle. "No, indeed," chuckled the magician. "We're going to make quite an entrance if all goes according to plan. The line doesn't want passengers getting upset. This way they'll think I'm coming as a surprise entertainer." "How did you manage this?" said Eva, there to see the men off. "During the war, I donated to the Navy a diving suit men could escape from in 10 seconds in a jam by throwing a switch. I also happened to save a Navy pilot while I was showing a bunch of guys how to use it. I asked him if the airline had a spare plane. She's a beaut, isn't she?" Eva had borrowed a clean dress from Bess, who also combed her hair and fixed her makeup. She looked fresh as a daisy. "It's a pity it carries only 2, she said wistfully. "I'd rather hoped I would be on the team for the last leg of our adventure."
"Adventure," Conan Doyle marveled to himself. "This bonny lass truly is bounced back. She has the resilience of a rugby forward. You believe she's fast enough to overtake the ocean liner?" he asked Houdini, taking a puff on his pipe.
"She's been clocked at better than 117 miles per hour, the escape artist confirmed. "We can catch up with the Victoria in 2.5 hours if the coordinates the wireless operator got from the captain are right."
"The problem, I suppose, is that if we don't find her, we'll be in rather a tough spot."
"The flying boat carries enough fuel to take us 340 miles. 3 hours.
Well, that's cutting it a bit fine. What if we run out of fuel?"
Houdini laughed. "Well, they call it a seaplane, don't they?" As they prepared to board the plane, Eva gave each man an affectionate embrace. She'd had time to spritz on some of that audacious perfume, and neither could ignore it, nor could any other red-blooded man. "My 2 gallant heroes," the green-eyed damsel said. "If you were both unattached, I should have a dreadful time choosing between you." Houdini raised his eyebrows in curiosity. "Honestly now, which would it be?"
Conan Doyle elbowed him and sternly said, "A gentleman shouldn't dream of asking such a thing."
Eva laughed, and of course a lady would never reply. As the men crossed the gangplank to the plane, each man was confident that he knew the answer. Propelled by twin 420-horsepower engines, the seaplane soared more than 16,000 feet over the Atlantic, with Houdini in a flying helmet and goggles at the controls. He was a trained pilot, in fact the 25th man to fly a powered aircraft. In 1908, 3 years after the Wright brothers first flew, he'd offered them $5,000 for one of their planes. They demurred, so he ended up buying a French Voisin ENV-238. Houdini was the first aviator to fly in Australia, and an enormous crowd applauded his dramatic landing at Digger's Rest. He'd actually planned a stunt in which he would jump out of a plane in a straitjacket, extricate himself while in free fall, and open a parachute just before hitting the ground. But he never got the chance to pull it off.
"Never knew you were a real pilot, old boy," Conan Doyle said, "but I saw that remarkable scene in The Grim Game where you climbed on the wing and used a rope to drop into the other fellow's plane. Quite thrilling, particularly when the planes collided. Took a great deal of planning, I expect."
"Pure accident," Houdini revealed, shaking his head. "The director had the smarts to keep the camera rolling." The magician pointed at the controls. "Not much to it. You ever fly once, Arthur?"
"Arthur will do." Never really wanted the title, and would have turned King Edward down if that wouldn't be an unpardonable breach of etiquette. Had to settle for Dale Holmes turning his nose up at a knighthood.
Well then, Arthur, ever been this high before?
Back in '01, I took a flight on a balloon. We got up to 1.5 miles. The most extraordinary sensation I've ever experienced. The aeronaut was gracious enough to let me handle her for 20 minutes. And that, I'm afraid, is the full extent of my attempts to mimic Icarus.
Care to give it a whirl, then? The controls are quite simple. A 10-year-old could do it.
It didn't take much to persuade Conan Doyle. He'd taken a crack at virtually every mode of terrestrial transportation, camels, elephants, motorcycles. He grinned broadly as Houdini moved over and allowed him to take control of the Model 75. Almost immediately, the plane dipped 200 feet, giving the author quite a start.
"You'll get the hang of it in no time," Houdini assured his friend, patting him on the back. He looked in the rear of the plane, which could seat at least a half-dozen passengers. "Do you really think it was fair to tell Eva the plane could only seat 2?
Conan Doyle nodded. "It was my fault that she found herself in that cursed death trap. I simply could not bring myself to place her in harm's way a second time."
Conan Doyle's words about cutting it rather fine turned out to be prophetic. 2 hours and 45 minutes later, they still hadn't spotted the ocean liner. All that could be seen below was an endless expanse of water. The author consulted his pocket watch.
"A smidge behind schedule."
"We may have to ditch prematurely," Houdini replied grimly. "Sorry about that, Arthur. I was so fired up about catching this nut, I didn't think it through."
"Don't fret, old chap. I'm quite an excellent swimmer, or was in my youth. Quite sure it comes back, like riding a bicycle."
I really had my heart set on making that entrance. It was going to be spectacular. Conan Doyle, scanning the blue vista, saw a tiny object in the horizon.
"Look! It seems the Lord watches over reckless fools."
Chapter 16 continued. Aboard the Victoria, cheering passengers crowded the railing as the plane with Houdini emblazoned on its side did magnificent loops. "Ooh! Ah!" they gasped in a chorus as the seaplane buzzed the ship no more than 50 feet overhead. The plane then began a rapid ascent, climbing at its maximum rate of 750 feet per minute. When it was far overhead, the aircraft leveled off. For a few moments, the dramatic movement ceased, and it circled the Victoria as if in a holding pattern. "Looks like he's done, then," said a tall man with a Cockney accent, with obvious disappointment. "No, see! Good heavens, he's out on the wing!" a gentleman in tweeds cried. Sure enough, the famed escape artist was inching his way out on the wing. He maneuvered gingerly on his backside, struggling to maintain his balance as the plane tilted first to the left, then the right. "What's that thing he's got on?" a little boy in a red cap asked. "It's a bloody straitjacket," yelled the Cockney with delight. "He's going to jump, he is." As the seaplane began to descend, Houdini suddenly leaped from the wing. A woman fainted, and several people cried out in horror.
"It's all right,"
an officer assured them. "He's jumping over water."
"He most certainly will not be all right," said a white-haired New Englander. "I am a professor of physics at Harvard, and I can assure you he will break every bone in his body when he hits the water from that height. He might as well land on cobblestones."
"He must be wearing a parachute underneath," another passenger guessed shrewdly. The magician tumbled end over end in free fall as he endeavored to extricate himself from the white jacket. "Doesn't have much time," the Cockney pointed out, a fact that was quite obvious to all in attendance. On the other side of the ship, the plane careened into the water with a huge splash.
The few who could tear their eyes away from the plummeting escape artist as he wiggled furiously in midair saw the pilot make a perfect landing. The seaplane bobbed on its skids on the surface like a Polynesian's catamaran. Just as it seemed there was no hope the parachute could open in time, Houdini pulled the jacket over his head and flung it away. He pulled the ripcord, and a white chute inflated instantly. The audience applauded raucously, and overhead the daredevil gave a triumphant salute. In a few seconds he hit the water, disappearing beneath the surface as the parachute spread out. Captain Jones, who had been watching from the bridge, ordered a launch sent out to retrieve him. Meanwhile, on the starboard side of the ship, a large man with a walrus mustache emerged from the cockpit and stood at the open door. He, too, gave a hearty wave.
"Look, Daddy, there's the pilot," cried the little boy.
"Who is he?"
the passenger asked.
"Whoever he is, he can handle himself in the air."
"No, I bet Houdini himself was flying it first," said an Australian, doing all them stunts. "He's a pilot. He's a pilot. I saw him land in Digger's Rest when I was no taller than this fella here."
"I shall personally buy him a bottle of champagne when he gets aboard," the gentleman in the tweed said. "That was quite the most splendid performance I've ever seen."
The launch reached the parachute, which floated like a colossal jellyfish Jules Verne might have imagined. The sailors lifted it up and saw no sign of Houdini. They gestured to the skipper, shaking their heads. Again passengers gasped, and the fainting woman, who had just recovered, passed out again.
"He's drowned!"
a panicked voice exclaimed.
"Houdini's drowned!"
Standing at the open door of the seaplane, which was being tossed about by the high waves, Sir Arthur smiled broadly. All was going exactly according to plan. Rather remarkable, he thought, since there had of course been no opportunity for a rehearsal. Houdini was in no danger at all, the writer knew. He was a powerful long-distance swimmer who inured himself to cold, with ice baths for his many water escapes, such as the Chinese water torture cell and his famous dive, manacled, from a bridge into San Francisco Bay. Suddenly, a 6-foot swell rocked the plane, and Conan Doyle tumbled out. The big man hit with a grand splash and sank alarmingly deep. By the time he bobbed spluttering to the surface, waves had carried the plane yards away. This was most definitely not part of the plan, he thought. Sir Arthur was not unused to cold water either. His first job after medical school was as a surgeon on the Arctic whaler, the Hope. He'd served 6 months at sea, not only doctoring, but participating in hunts. Young Conan Doyle had even shot an 11-foot sea elephant. Big as an ox, he tumbled off the ice 4 times in 5 days, earning him the nickname Great Northern Diver among the crew. This was no Arctic weather, not even the 28 degrees those poor devils on the Titanic had faced. But it was dreadfully cold, and it was a struggle to stay afloat, let alone swim, in his heavy clothes. The captain ordered the ship turned, and it did, with agonizing slowness. The Victoria, steaming toward Sir Arthur, looked terribly far away. Putting the distance out of his mind, the author strode toward it manfully. "What the devil was I thinking? I'm no stout lad in my 20s. Was I trying to prove I'm as great a man of action as Houdini?" He began to tire, and the icy water felt like pinpricks. Conan Doyle now recalled a less than riotously funny spill in the Arctic. He had just killed a seal on a large ice floe when he lost his balance and fell over the side. None of his crewmates were near, and the water was freezing. He'd held on to the edge of the ice to prevent himself from sinking, but it was too smooth and slippery to gain a purchase, and he couldn't haul himself out of the water. Finally, in desperation, he grabbed hold of the dead seal's hind flippers and sought to pull himself up.
For a few moments there was a nightmarish tug-of-war, and it was uncertain whether he would pull himself up or pull the seal down with him. Some higher power must have been watching over the clumsy young fool, for by some miracle he prevailed. Closer to drowning now than he had been then, he recalled how he had refused to surrender to fear or cold. "You can do it, old man," he told himself. And indeed he could. As the ship drew close, he continued to stroke arm over arm, albeit slower and slower, putting the crawl in crawl. A few moments later, the crew hauled him with ropes up onto the starboard side of the deck. "Who is he?" asked a puzzled woman, as crewmen wrapped a blanket around the large, shivering man. "Is that Houdini?" Captain Jones strode toward the rescued man, and the crowd parted to allow him to reach the rider.
"May I present to you the world-famous author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes," he declared with a broad smile. He shook Sir Arthur's hand. "The White Star Line arranged for them to arrive so spectacularly."
The crowd applauded.
"But where's Houdini?"
asked the boy.
"He's dead, drowned," the Cockney said.
"Harry Houdini is very much alive, I can assure you with authority," came a stentorian voice from behind the crowd. People turned and were astonished to see the celebrated magician safe and sound. Wearing a swimsuit that covered him from neck to his ankles, he was soaking wet. Somehow, when their attention was on the rescue, he had scaled the port side of the ship. "Thank you, Sir Arthur, for assisting me in this little entertainment," he said as he strutted to join his friend. "And I ask that you all thank Captain Jones for his graciousness in allowing us to make this ostentatious entrance." "Will you be performing, Mr. Houdini?" asked the fainting woman, now back on her feet. "I thought I just did," the magician said, and the passengers laughed and applauded. "Well, I'll do a few little tricks for you tonight, and perhaps Sir Arthur Conan Doyle will be so kind as to read us one of his short stories." Conan Doyle, teeth chattering, nodded.
"It shall be my pleasure."
Chapter 17. The Trap. In the captain's quarters, the white-bearded skipper turned to the new passengers as soon as the door was shut. "All right, then, gentlemen. I played along and did exactly as you requested in your wireless message. I have placed men outside Mr. Watson's cabin with orders that he not be allowed to leave. Understand that I'd never have taken such an extraordinary step except for your reputations. I trust that it is more than some publicity stunt, and I have not put my career in jeopardy for naught." "There is indeed a good reason," said Conan Doyle. He could not help taking a dramatic pause before declaring, "This Watson is not who he claims to be. You have a murderer aboard this ship." Over the next 15 minutes he recounted to Captain Jones their extraordinary adventure and the results of their investigation into the spook house. Houdini jumped in from time to time to interject details his companion overlooked. At the end of the story, Captain Jones was completely nonplussed. "That is the most remarkable story I've ever heard," he declared. "It tops anything my good friend Sir Arthur could have dreamed up, and that's saying a lot," Houdini agreed. "What we request now is that you place this fiend, George Langdon, in the brig and turn the ship about. It is my understanding that under maritime law, as captain of a ship, you have the authority to place him under arrest." Captain Jones nodded. "It's quite unusual, but under the extraordinary circumstances, that is, of course, the proper course of action." Conan Doyle heaved a sigh of relief, and Houdini smiled with satisfaction. "Come with me, gentlemen," the captain said. "I'll be able to tell my grandchildren I saw Sherlock Holmes capture a murderer." The two sailors guarding the first-class cabin of John Watson saluted and stood aside as the captain and his guests arrived. Captain Jones rapped on the door. "Mr. Watson, I must ask you to open this door," he said sternly. There followed a moment of silence. "It's no use stalling, Landon," Houdini said. "The jig is up." After a moment the door opened, and a small, bespectacled man appeared at the door. With his shock of white hair, he looked close to 70. "Now, see here, I demand to know what this is all about," he said. "I haven't been allowed on deck, and my doctor says I need sea air for my constitution." He added a bit more timidly, "Well, perhaps not demand, but I do think it's only proper, isn't it?" Houdini turned from the little old man to Sir Arthur. "I think this is where you're supposed to grab a fistful of his hair and say, 'That's the most ridiculous wig I've ever seen.'" Conan Doyle groaned. Captain Jones asked,
"I take it this isn't George Langdon?"
The red-faced investigators shook their heads. The captain made his apologies to Mr. Watson, a retired shoe company owner from Philadelphia, promising him a seat at his dinner table that evening. He said a curt goodbye to the two famous men, leaving them to nurse their bruised egos.
"Chasing our own tails,"
Conan Doyle cried, pounding a wall of the passageway in frustration. "Look on the bright side," said Houdini. "There's still a 50-50 chance we're on the right ship."
"And the odds are the same that the black-hearted scoundrel is on his merry way to New Zealand, doubtless to build a summer home of his peculiar patented design."
A voice called to them from down the hall.
"Harry! Arthur! Thank God you're here!"
They looked up to see Paul Langdon rushing toward them. He embraced the magician. "How in God's name did you find me?" "Never mind that. What are you doing on this ship?" said Houdini. "Come into my stateroom," the young man said, ushering them into the first-class cabin. With oak paneling, oriental rugs, and a canopy bed, it was as lavish as anything on the Mauretania. "I guess you'd say I'm on the run," he told them. "The day after your visit, I received a telegram from the asylum saying that my father had escaped. A short time later, Father telephoned me from God knows where and said he wanted a family reunion. The way he said it, well, it frightened me. I've been offered an opportunity to build bridges overseas, and this suddenly seemed like a good time to leave the country. Am I a terrible coward?"
"Not at all," replied Sir Arthur. "But you haven't been the wisest in your choice of ships."
"Why isn't your name on the manifest?" "I booked my passage under the name Paulson, to be sure my father couldn't track me. Once I was aboard, a Harvard man recognized me from a magazine story, and I didn't see any harm in letting him know who I am. Others know me now. I thought perhaps my fears were silly, but all the time I've been aboard, I've had the sense I'm being watched. What's going on? Why are you here?"
Sir Arthur looked at Houdini, who nodded. "Sit down, Paul, and I must ask you to brace yourself," the author said.
Paul Langdon shook visibly as Houdini and Conan Doyle told them about their terrifying imprisonment in the spook house. Conan Doyle spared him only the discovery of his dear cousin Donald and their childhood friend Daisy.
"So you see, we believe your father is aboard this ship in disguise and under an assumed name."
"He's like a chameleon," Houdini said. "I take it he got rave reviews in those local plays you told us about." Not surprisingly, the young man reached for a bottle of gin and poured himself a straight shot. "This is quite a shock," he said, running a hand through his wavy blonde hair. "But surely it can't be a coincidence. He and I aboard the same ship?" Conan Doyle sat beside him, equally morose.
"There's only one explanation that readily comes to mind. Your father is determined to murder you."
"Father? Kill me? No, it's not possible," exclaimed the young engineer. Houdini sat beside the two. "We know that he exterminated your dear cousin Donald and another male relative we couldn't identify."
"My own father? I'm afraid your father, however affectionate he may have been at one time, with the picnics, the storytelling, and the little plays at home, is now, to speak plainly, a monster," Conan Doyle said somberly. "He is not bound by familial bonds or, indeed, any rules of civilized conduct."
Houdini assured the young man, "We'll do everything in our power to protect you, Paul, but you must be on your guard. We have no idea what cunning disguise he's adopted now." Paul, the color of chalk, downed the rest of the gin in one gulp. Conan Doyle patted his shoulder in a fatherly manner.
There, there. Keep your spirits up, young man. It's always darkest before the dawn.
As soon as they were out of earshot of Paul's stateroom, they fought to get the word out first, and sputtered in unison, "It's him!" For they had, of course, deduced that it was Paul Langdon, not his father, who was the murderer and master of the spook house. It was that Langdon Houdini had battled on the train.
"Well, do you think he fell for our ruse?"
Sir Arthur asked. "I doubt it. You'd have to think we were a pair of dunces. No, I think he's playing along to see what we do next." Needing a private location to compare notes, they hurried to the first-class cabin that Captain Jones had arranged for them.
"He certainly put the theatrical training his father gave him to good use,"
Sir Arthur said, pouring them each a cup of tea.
"He was not only Smalls and Bancroft, but indubitably the Frenchman who managed the inn and oversaw the unspeakable crimes."
"Let's not forget the orderly O'Casey, who freed George Langdon from the madhouse,
only to trap him in that horrible room as soon as they took refuge in their old family abode," finished Conan Doyle.
"The dead man we found wearing the ring that bore the family crest was George Langdon. Blast it! We should have thought it odd that Paul never mentioned a relative disappearing other than this cousin of whom he was so fond." Houdini nodded thoughtfully. "It never occurred to me that as a civil engineer, Paul was as able to monkey around with the house as easily as his father, the architect." Conan Doyle puffed on his pipe, his mind racing.
"So we must discount everything we learned from the caretaker, the newspaper man, and Paul himself, including the Indian legend nonsense. All the disappearances that took place in the 19th century and before he was a boy of 13, unless corroborated by an independent source, we may assume to be balderdash, except, of course, the dog, which I imagine the budding killer disposed of himself.
Probably died starving in some box in the woods, or tied to a post like that poor mutt in the old slave quarters," Houdini said angrily. "Never crossed my mind that dog might be starving to death. The evil bastard."
"I don't doubt it. Many of the truly vicious killers I've read about cut their teeth torturing and slaying animals before they worked their way up to humans."
"We're agreed, then. There's no proof of anything supernatural taking place in that house, and the slave owner's wife, Mrs. Rouston, not a witch or a necromancer at all, but
simply an ill-tempered shrew."
"And did you get a load of that name?"
Sir Arthur stopped puffing. "Paulson, indeed. He really does like to prove to himself how bloody clever he is."
The gentlemen detectives asked to meet with the captain once again.
"And so we must ask you to put Paul Langdon under arrest immediately," Sir Arthur said triumphantly.
Captain Jones frowned.
"I'm not certain I have the authority to do that." "Why, as captain of a ship, you most certainly have the authority."
While aboard the Mayumba, Conan Doyle had seen the captain wield his power unsparingly, ordering floggings routinely, and even threatening a man with hanging. "I don't get it," Houdini said impatiently. "An hour ago you were gung-ho to arrest his father."
"Exactly. First you accuse the father, now the son. I've already terrorized a poor old man. What proof do you really have of this young man's guilt? What I hear is only conjecture. Paul Langdon is a prominent man in his field. If we go off half-cocked, and I have him thrown in the brig, and he later proves himself innocent, the line could be sued for slander, to say nothing of myself personally.
The White Star Line survived the Titanic. I think it will survive this. If you take that homicidal maniac to Borneo, you're twice the lame brain the skipper of that tub was." Captain Jones stepped toward him.
"Sir, I don't like your tone."
Conan Doyle inserted his bulky frame between them.
"Captain, if we provide you with incontrovertible proof, will you then arrest him?" "Proof of murder? Well, yes, I would have no choice." "Very well. You shall have your proof."
As they left the captain's quarters and proceeded to the forward deck, Houdini turned to his friend. "Okay, Arthur, I'm all ears."
"I have a notion of how we can ferret the villain out, but we shall have to gather together some confederates."
"Exactly what do you have in mind?"
Conan Doyle smiled. "Are you game for another séance?"
Chapter 17 Continued. Several other celebrities graced the passenger manifest of the Victoria, including the actress Lillian Gish. She was a favorite of D.W. Griffith, known for his lavish productions like the monumental epic Intolerance, budgeted at the then unheard-of figure of $2.5 million. Lillian's last picture was Orphans of the Storm, for which Griffith had shipped the cast and crew to Europe and recreated scenes from the French Revolution at great expense. Now she was on her way to meet him to play a missionary in another ambitious film set in the jungles of Borneo. Houdini had met her in Hollywood and was impressed by the sweet nature of the freckle-faced starlet, still in her 20s. "The kid isn't full of herself like most of those prima donnas," Houdini told Conan Doyle. When the magician asked her to play a key role in the séance, she agreed at once. A young foreign correspondent and fledgling writer named Ernest Hemingway was bound for South Africa. Houdini wished a real author was aboard, but reluctantly agreed that he'll have to do. Hemingway, too, eagerly accepted Conan Doyle's invitation to join in the séance.
"Good show,"
Sir Arthur said.
"Anything for a fellow scribbler," replied the American. "Now you owe me a skiing lesson, and an introduction to some publishers wouldn't hurt either."
The widow of the magician's old pal, Jack London, author of Call of the Wild, was also aboard. Mrs. Charmaine London, a dark-haired beauty with an impressive bust, expressed just as much enthusiasm when they explained the plan in her stateroom. As Sir Arthur and Houdini left, she gave the escape artist a peck on the cheek and whispered in his ear, "I wasn't sure I'd see you again, my magic man." In the hallway outside the cabin, Houdini hastily drew out his handkerchief and used it to wipe her crimson lipstick from his cheek, glancing at Conan Doyle to gauge his reaction. The author wore a poker face that would put Diamond Jim Brady to shame.
"Jolly good luck we have acquaintances on this ship,"
he said cheerily. But while Conan Doyle might have a gift for self-deception, lack of candor did not come naturally to him. "He's heard about my fling with Mrs. London," Houdini thought. And yet, even during their vicious quarrel in the spook house, when he'd raked Conan Doyle over the coals for infidelity, this British gentleman had been too honorable to bring up the magician's own moral lapse. "Arthur, you truly are the better man," he said to the author humbly, as they stood in the hallway outside Mrs. London's stateroom.
"Haven't the foggiest notion what you're talking about," replied Conan Doyle, withdrawing his watch from his vest pocket. "Come now, dear fellow, we don't want to be late for our rehearsal with Miss Gish."
That evening, Houdini regaled passengers, including Paul Langdon, with small yet dazzling feats of magic. Most baffling was his famous needle mystery, in which he appeared to swallow 5 packs of needles and 20 feet of thread, and then drew them out of his throat, strung together. Afterward, Conan Doyle recited his short story, The Parasite, in his powerful baritone. It was a lurid, supernatural tale about a young man who falls under the sway of a homely, middle-aged hypnotist after she plants in his mind the suggestion that he loves her. The notion grows like a parasite and consumes him. Conan Doyle had never given a public reading of the tale before. Audiences preferred humorous tales, such as the exploits of his bumbling cavalryman, Lieutenant Gerard, to a gruesome story like this. But for their current purpose, to imbue the night with a sense of creepiness, the eerie yarn was ideal. Conan Doyle had mastered the art of speaking while running for Parliament. His political career died in infancy, but he could still throw his voice to the back of a large lecture hall and could inject emotion into the recitation of the telephone book. By the time he reached the denouement, when the hero was forced to stalk his fiancée with a vial of acid in his hands, one could hear a pin drop in the ship's ballroom. After the thunderous applause died down, the famed spiritualist announced that a few select passengers would be joining him that evening for a séance.
Miss Lillian Gish, the celebrated actress, has informed me that she has certain gifts as a medium. We are going to put them to the test.
So Arthur announced the short list of invitees: Captain Jones, Harry Houdini, Miss Gish, Hemingway, Mrs. London, and the noted engineer, Paul Langdon. The crowd mumbled, many passengers grumbling that they would not be able to witness such a once-in-a-lifetime event. The guests filed into one of the ship's 3 private dining salons, first the captain, then Paul and the others. Square-jawed, broad-shouldered Hemingway, who'd served as an ambulance driver in the Great War and received an Italian Medal of Bravery at the age of 18, was a pragmatist if ever there lived one.
"I've been hearing about this tomfoolery for years, Harry," the brash 23-year-old said. "I really had to see it firsthand."
He patted Conan Doyle's bicep.
"Don't mean to ruffle your feathers, old sport. I know you're a true believer, but I won't believe in ghosts until I see one with my own eyes."
Sir Arthur gave a tight smile.
"If all goes well, perhaps you'll have your chance tonight."
Charmaine London followed on his heels. She took Sir Arthur's hand. "It's darling of you to include me, Sir Arthur. I'm quite excited by the whole thing." Taking one glance at handsome young Hemingway, she elected to sit close beside him. Lillian entered at last, still looking the wide-eyed ingenue she'd played in Griffith's Birth of a Nation when she was barely out of her teens. "I've practiced in the mirror," she whispered to Sir Arthur at the doorway. "I hope I don't let you down."
"We have the utmost confidence in you, my dear," Conan Doyle replied, taking her hands reassuringly.
Paul Langdon, wearing a ruffled tuxedo shirt that gave him the look of a 19th-century dandy, rose to greet her, as did the captain.
"Miss Lillian Gish, the renowned American motion picture actress, this is Paul Langdon of Virginia, an esteemed engineer. I believe you know everyone else, Lillian."
"This is quite an honor, but I'm not quite sure why I was invited to join such an illustrious group," Paul said.
"I believe we will require help from the other side to solve this mystery. We need your full cooperation, and with it I think we may be able to bring this entire matter to a satisfactory close."
Langdon could not resist a small smirk. "I tend to doubt that, Sir Arthur. I'm afraid this case is beyond even your intellectual powers."
"We shall see, shan't we?"
the author replied, ushering Lillian to her seat at the oval dinner table.
"Before we start,"
Conan Doyle said, turning to the actress,
"I should like Miss Gish to tell us a bit about her experiences."
The actress began in her girlishly innocent voice. "My sister Dorothy and I have always been quite close, and sometimes the bond is extraordinary. There are times when we've been miles apart, I in New York and she in California, and we buy exactly the same dress. It's been that way since we were children. Mother and Father marveled at it."
"Thought transference," Sir Arthur explained to the others. "We're all capable of it, but the effect is most powerful between siblings. And kindly tell us about the other part."
"Sometimes when I'm playing a role, it's as if my own personality disappears, retreats into me, and someone else takes over my body. When I was doing Orphans of the Storm, a solid hour passed in which I couldn't recall a thing. One of the stagehands said I'd been going about saying I was Camille, a French girl who served Marie Antoinette in the palace." "How simply stunning!" exclaimed Mrs. London.
Conan Doyle nodded. "So now you see why I have been so keen to do a séance with young Lillian. I'm hoping that she may be able to make contact with the other side, perhaps learn something about the house."
"That would be quite something," Paul said. "And afterward, perhaps she could reenact a scene from Birth of the Nation. Perhaps that bit where she's ravished by that drooling darky, or was that the other girl?" Sir Arthur went on as if the suspect's sarcasm had gone over his head.
"That would be splendid. It was a marvelous picture. History told in lightning, I think your President Wilson said. Now, Harry, the lights, if you would."
Houdini dimmed the lights so that the invitees' faces were barely visible.
"Now, shut your eyes and clear your mind of old thoughts, Lillian. Forget we are here. Breathe slowly and deeply.
The actress obeyed, shutting her eyes and sitting still. Her pale skin glowed in the dim light, giving her childlike face a ghostly appearance. They sat in silence for close to 10 minutes. Hemingway began to drum his fingers on the table. "Stop that, dear," Mrs. London scolded him. "It's only I have a card game to go to," he said, but stopped. After another 5 minutes, Lillian began to sway gently and hum. "What's that?" the captain whispered to Houdini. "Sounds like that old song kids sing, 'Ring Around the Rosie.'" Lillian threw back her head, and then her head rolled slowly forward. Her eyes were glassy, and her face was so contorted that she looked like another person entirely. "Why did you do it?" she said. Her voice was different, masculine but still youthful. "It's happening," whispered Mrs. London.
"To whom are we speaking?"
Conan Doyle said calmly. "I am Donald Langdon III, Lillian droned.
"Who the devil is that?" said Hemingway. "Never heard of him."
Houdini turned to Paul. "Isn't that the name of your cousin, your boyhood playmate who went missing?" The young man nodded, beginning to tremble. "Why did you do it?" Lillian moaned.
"Who is she, or he, talking to?" asked Captain Jones.
"To he who murdered me," the voice said.
"Well, now this is getting interesting," said Hemingway.
"Do hush up," hissed Mrs. London. "Well, let's get to the bottom of it," Houdini said. "Who killed you?" Lillian raised her arm, moved it about like a divining rod, and then, with her pale, delicate hand, pointed at Paul. Mrs. London gasped as they all turned to the young engineer. He covered his mouth, aghast. "Why did you do it, Paul?" the spirit said through Lillian. "You know that I am the one who loved you, not the love of a cousin, that other love. How I long for your touch. I loved you, Paul. Why did you do it?"
"Stop!" Langdon shrieked. "Stop this nonsense at once." "Like hell. It's just getting good," said Hemingway.
"Turn on the lights," Paul demanded.
"If you'd be so kind, Harry,"
Conan Doyle said. Houdini turned on the lights. Lillian, returning to herself, shook her head, and her light brown hair flew in all directions. "What happened?" "What happened," Paul said heatedly, and shaking a finger at Conan Doyle, "is that your friends tried to snare me with a cheap parlor trick." He added with a sneer, "You really are a pathetic old self-deluded buffoon if you thought some hackneyed ploy straight out of a mystery novel would outfox me." "I swear Lillian protested. Paul began to laugh hysterically. "What you don't know is that it was I who was in love with Donald, but as it turned out, he wasn't inclined to return those sorts of feelings. I discovered, much to my dismay, found them utterly revolting, as a matter of fact. Still, you might have won, dear Harry and Artie, and I'll confess your tart hair actually had me going for a moment. But I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Donnie wouldn't say such dribble because he got engaged to a woman, his beloved little Daisy." Conan Doyle merely smiled and took out his pipe. Silently he filled it from a tobacco pouch. Paul stood. "So I'm afraid you've solved nothing, and if your guests won't mind my excusing myself—" The author interrupted him. "On the contrary, sir, it's all solved rather neatly. By your own words you've condemned yourself." "How so?" the killer demanded. Conan Doyle lit his pipe.
"You see, the lovebirds were not engaged until moments before their death, in a sealed room. The only person who would have known of their engagement was the man who murdered them."
Captain Jones stood up. "My God, gentlemen, it really worked."
"Is that satisfactory for an arrest, Captain?" the author said, as if discussing a bridge game. "It is indeed," Captain Jones declared. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to accompany Mr. Langdon."
The killer, panicking, ran for the door, knocking over his chair. He flung the door open, only to find that 2 sailors stood outside, waiting to take him into custody. Paul turned back to the room, stared at Conan Doyle, and laughed. "You know, I really did see the old hag." Conan Doyle looked at him sadly and pointed at the deranged killer with the stem of his pipe.
"And I suspect you always shall."
Chapter 17. Continued.
Part 2.
Once caught dead to rights, Paul confessed fully and even enthusiastically, boasting of his cleverness at every turn. His fascination with holding living things captive and watching them slowly perish had begun in early childhood, commencing with insects and graduating to cats and dogs, including his own. His mother discovered this habit and tried to cure me with affection to no avail, as he put it. After she rescued a hungry, missing toddler from one of Paul's increasingly elaborate traps, she made preparations to have him institutionalized. So he murdered her. It was the discovery of this unthinkable act that drove his father, George, mad. With no parental interference to hamper him, Paul embarked on his life's work, the collection and observation of humankind. After college, he installed the mystery room in the family home before turning it into an inn. While posing as the French manager, he selected victims from among his guests who passed through the inn. Not at random, he insisted to his captors, those that interested me. After the peaceful rest's unseemly reputation caused it to shut down, he visited it whenever he wished to entrap other helpless souls, posing as Smalls in order to linger unnoticed in the vicinity. Nights when the weather was especially foul, he'd always be found at the old house, waiting for an unlucky traveler to take refuge in his lair. Judge Parker, whom Paul didn't know, had the ill fortune to step into that snare. He didn't bear ill will toward any of his victims, he claimed, although he admitted that if his cousin Donald had returned his affections, he'd have been more inclined to spare his life for a while, rather than lure him and his sweetheart to the house. Paul took the job as an orderly at the sanitarium to spirit his father away and bring him to the spook house. I thought he would be proud of what I'd achieved, the killer said, but he wasn't at all. Houdini and Sir Arthur stood at the railing of the Victoria as it steamed toward America with the murderer in the brig. The magician puffed on a cigar while his friend smoked a pipe. They gazed over the tranquil sea. "So, Harry, you proved me wrong this time," the author sighed. "There was nothing in that house unnatural, except the unnatural evil of one demented man. I suppose you must think me a great fool. Well, perhaps you'll have better luck next time, and we'll catch a ghost instead of a man. I don't expect we shall be doing any more investigations together," Conan Doyle said with a sad smile. "I imagine you're more convinced than ever that spiritualism amounts to poppycock. But my belief that contact with the other side is possible is undiminished, and I shall recommit myself with even greater vigor to proving it to the public. I fear we may soon be at each other's throats." Houdini shook his head emphatically. Sir Arthur went on. "I wish to be remembered as a champion of spiritualism. My books will be forgotten soon after I'm gone, just as with 1,000 writers before me. And you, Houdini, your name shall be synonymous with magic for the rest of time." Houdini smiled. "Thanks for the compliment, but I think long after the world has forgotten Houdini, your Sherlock Holmes will be around and kicking." Conan Doyle laughed. "You might be onto something there, Harry. He does seem to be hard to kill off." Houdini gazed at the horizon. "Arthur, no matter what happens, I want us to remain friends. That moment on the cliff, when I was dangling there helpless, and I heard your voice ordering me to reach, it was as full of warmth and strength as my own father's voice. For a moment, before I saw your face, I thought it was my father's voice." When Conan Doyle did not reply, Houdini turned to him. "I didn't say reach. I rather expected under the circumstances you would. I didn't say anything at all." "You're not putting me on?" "Upon my honor." Amazement spread across Houdini's face like dawn rising. Conan Doyle smiled and took a puff on the pipe. "Then I suppose the two of us might squeeze in one more adventure before we go our separate ways." The end.